I noticed the draft before I noticed the seam. That was the kind of thing I tended to notice first. Not because I was especially perceptive in any poetic sense, but because I had spent most of my adult life thinking about how water and air preferred to move when no one was paying attention. I was a municipal water systems engineer for the city of Marlow, Indiana, which meant my days were spent with maps, pressure zones, storage volumes, leak reports, booster stations, and the quieter side of public life that only becomes visible when it stops working. At home, I had much the same habit. I noticed small changes in doors, floorboards, pipe sounds, humidity levels, window condensation, the way the furnace took a little longer in October than it had the previous year. I had bought the house 5 years earlier from the estate of an older couple named the Danners, and though it was structurally ordinary, a one-story brick ranch with a low roof line, aluminum gutters, a small detached garage, and a broad, unfinished basement, it had the accumulated improvisations of a place that had been lived in carefully for a long time. Extra shelves where shelves were not part of the original plan. 3 generations of paint. A shut-off valve labeled in neat pencil on masking tape that had somehow remained legible for 40 years. The basement floor had been painted that gray-green color people used to use when they wanted concrete to look respectable. There were metal shelving units along the west wall, old canning hooks over the workbench, a freestanding chest freezer, and beneath the basement stairs, a shallow storage alcove where I kept folded lawn chairs, a cracked red cooler, and a coil of garden hose I never used, but somehow never threw away. The draft was coming from there. It was late October. The furnace had just started earning its keep again. I had gone downstairs after dinner because the washing machine made a brief thump in its spin cycle that I had decided, without any real urgency, to investigate. I was halfway across the basement when I felt a narrow stripe of cool air against my left ankle. Not a general basement coolness. Something directional. Something moving. I set my mug on the workbench and went over to the alcove under the stairs. The lawn chairs were in the way. So was the cooler. I moved both, then crouched and looked along the baseboard. The wall under the stairs had been paneled at some point in the 70s with thin, fake walnut sheets, and most of it sat flush, but in the back corner, there was a vertical line I had somehow never registered. Not a crack exactly. Too straight for that. It ran from about 4 inches above the floor to just under the angle of the staircase. I touched it. There was a hollow sensation behind the panel, not much, but enough to distinguish it from foundation concrete. I pressed harder. Nothing moved. Then I found a recessed metal pull, painted over so many times it looked like part of the wall, until I scraped it with my thumbnail. The panel shifted inward by less than an inch and stopped. I set my shoulder against it and pushed again. Something on the other side gave a muted, mechanical click, then held firm. Not swollen wood, not jammed shelving, a lock. I leaned back and tried the pull again, more carefully. The panel was not just paneling. It was a narrow wooden door, fitted into the space under the stairs, maybe 2 feet wide, old enough that its proportions looked slightly wrong to modern eyes. It opened inward, away from me. Or would have, if it had not been locked from the other side. I remember sitting back on my heels and looking at it for a while. There are moments that ought to feel dramatic but don't. Not at first. Mostly, they feel administrative. A hidden door beneath your house sounds, in summary, like the beginning of a certain kind of story. In the moment, it feels like one more item on a property maintenance list no one warned you about. I got a flashlight. I checked the perimeter of the frame. The latch side showed the clearest give. There was definitely a cavity beyond it. The cool air smelled faintly mineral, dry and old, not moldy, not sewer gas, not active rot. just enclosed air, and maybe earth. I stood there with the flashlight beam resting on the paint layers and thought, in a purely practical way, that if there was a room or crawlspace behind that door, I should probably know about it. Then I checked the time. It was 8:17, and I had to be at the utility office early the next morning, because we were revising winter pumping schedules for the North Zone after a recurring pressure drop near the hospital district. That was the first week I understood, in the calm and partial way such things arrive, that the city was beginning to move toward a problem much larger than a pressure map. At the time, it still felt like overlap. An unusual door under my stairs. An unusual cluster of illness reports. An unusual number of people calling in sick at the treatment plant. Each item alone had a reasonable explanation. Put together, they made a shape I did not yet want to name. I left the door alone that night. That was not caution in the dramatic sense. It was sequencing. The house had not collapsed. Nothing beneath the stairs seemed actively urgent. I put the lawn chairs back where they belonged, though not as neatly, and went upstairs with the thought that I would come back on Saturday with a pry bar, a notepad, and more patience. I had a quiet life then, which is another way of saying I had a life built mostly from repeatable things. I was 42, divorced for 6 years, not bitter about it anymore, just arranged differently than I had once expected. I lived alone except for a tabby cat named Ruth, who considered my presence useful, but non-essential. I drove the same silver Tacoma I had driven since my mid-30s. I packed lunch in a blue insulated bag with a broken zipper tab. I listened to AM radio for weather and baseball, out of habit more than preference. I spent my work days between the utility administration building and field sites, and my evenings in a house quiet enough that I could tell when the refrigerator compressor cycled on from the living room sofa. Marlow was the kind of city that still called itself a town if someone from Chicago was visiting. Mid-sized, brick-heavy, laid out around a river and a rail corridor, with neighborhoods old enough that everyone still referred to them by parish boundaries or long-demolished factories. My street sat on the east side, where post-war houses occupied modest lots with detached garages, chain-link fences, and maples that had outgrown their intended scale. It was not a fashionable neighborhood. That was one of its best qualities. People fixed things instead of replacing them. People saved coffee cans full of screws. People knew which basement corner got damp in a hard spring and which downspout needed leaf guards every October. At work, I managed models and maintenance forecasts. I tracked demand curves and hydraulic behavior. I liked systems because they rewarded attention. If something changed, it did so for a reason, even when the reason took time to locate. 3 days before I found the hidden door, I had noticed that water demand in the hospital pressure zone had increased sharply overnight, and then stayed high into morning. That happened sometimes in winter, during pipe breaks. But there had been no break report, and the pattern was wrong. The demand was distributed, not burst-like, laundry, sanitation, constant use. Simultaneously, a nursing facility on the west side reported low residual chlorine at its internal taps, which led to a round of sampling and a conversation with the facility's supervisor, who sounded distracted, apologized twice, and said they were having a rough week with infections. The next day, our wastewater analyst, Grace, sent around a short email noting irregularities in upstream testing from 2 sewer sheds. She wasn't an alarmist. She wrote the way some people fold shirts, neatly, once, and with no unnecessary gestures. Her email said only that something neurological or inflammatory might be moving through the county, and that the health department had requested more frequent samples. She added, almost as an afterthought, that she had never seen absentee rates rise this quickly across unrelated departments. Then there was the pharmacy line. I did not go looking for evidence of civil unraveling in those days. Most people never do. They notice one practical thing at a time. On Wednesday, I stopped at Lowry's pharmacy to pick up a refill for Ruth's thyroid medication and found 12 people in line, not one of them talking much, all waiting for things that were out of stock. The pharmacist was trying to explain substitutions over the counter with the exhausted voice of someone who had already explained the same thing 30 times to me. A young man in work boots kept checking his phone even though the signal was poor inside. An older woman asked if they had any more nitrile gloves. The answer was no. I bought 2 extra boxes of cold medicine without really deciding to. Not because I thought it would become valuable, just because scarcity is sometimes first visible in the faces of people who are being told no. By Thursday morning, 2 plant operators were out. One field tech had taken emergency leave because his brother had become disoriented, aggressive, and briefly unresponsive in the same hour. Someone in dispatch said the emergency department had asked Public Works not to send non-essential personnel near the annex entrance because ambulances were queuing there. That afternoon, I printed 3 months of water demand history and spread it across my desk. Most people, if they think of engineering at all, imagine equations arriving in a rush, as if insight were a dramatic event. Usually it is quieter than that. Usually it is a matter of comparing curves until one of them stops pretending to be normal. The city's night demand had risen almost everywhere, but not evenly. Residential use had spiked in clusters near assisted living centers, clinics, older apartment blocks, and 2 funeral homes. Pressure fluctuations suggested repeated, overlapping heavy draw, not at the level of industrial demand, but above ordinary household use. A lot of washing, a lot of cleaning, a lot of people awake at strange hours. I drove home with my windows cracked and the heater low, thinking about storage volume. I am aware that this is not how most people remember the week the world turned. Many remember noise, or headlines, or the first sight they can never quite put out of mind. I remember, first, numbers. Numbers are not the whole truth, but they have the decency not to be theatrical. They tell you when the ordinary is ending, without insisting you perform an emotion about it. That evening I made a list at my kitchen table. Water containers. Rice, oats, lentils. Batteries. Propane for the camp stove I used only during power outages. Cat food. A second carbon monoxide detector. Bleach. Work gloves. Plywood. Medical tape. Canned tomatoes. Coffee. The list did not say apocalypse. The list said extended service disruption, possible public health emergency, likely supply instability, low confidence in official timing. At the bottom, after a moment's thought, I added, inspect hidden door. I did not get to it on Friday, because by Friday, the city had started to close around itself in little pieces. The administration building stayed open, but the lobby doors were locked and entry went to badge access only. Our director held a short meeting in the conference room and told us to avoid rumor, continue operations, and prepare for possible rolling staffing shortages. He had the expression of a man trying to remain exactly 1 step behind panic and 2 steps ahead of paperwork. Grace was not there. Someone said she had developed a fever overnight. By noon, the county health department had issued a vague advisory about a rapidly evolving neurological infection and urged people to avoid unnecessary travel and monitor loved ones for confusion, fever, agitation, and sudden collapse. The local hospital requested water quality support in writing instead of by phone, which in my line of work is never a sign that anyone feels in control. That was the point at which I stopped pretending I was only being prudent. I left work early under the pretense of checking valve access near the East Reservoir, and instead drove to 3 stores in widening circles, buying what still remained, and not arguing when certain things were gone. People were not yet frightened in the loud sense. They were preoccupied, which can look the same from a distance. At the hardware store, 2 men in line bought chain and padlocks. At the grocery on Madison, a woman in hospital scrubs loaded canned soup into reusable tote bags, with the blank efficiency of someone who did not have time to think about what her actions implied. By dusk, my kitchen counters were crowded with dry goods, flashlight batteries, and the sort of practical food no one brags about liking, but everyone eats eventually. I filled the bathtub. I filled pitchers, pots, the coffee urn I used twice a year. I set the chest freezer to its coldest setting. I moved canned food from the pantry upstairs to the basement shelving, where the temperature was more stable. Then I carried a pry bar downstairs and stood again before the narrow door beneath the stairs. The draft was still there, finer now that I was waiting for it. I slid the pry bar carefully into the frame near the latch. The wood flexed. A dusting of old paint fell to the floor. I listened. Nothing. "Anybody there?" I said, more because the situation seemed to require the sentence than because I expected an answer. The basement held its own silence. I pried once, gently, and felt firm resistance on the far side. Not a simple latch, a deadbolt or sliding bar. Something engaged deliberately. I stopped. This is where temperament matters. Not heroism, not fearlessness. Just the quiet accumulation of past decisions that teach you what kind of person you are under mild uncertainty. I was not, by nature, a breaker of sealed things. If there was a room beyond that door, and if someone had once secured it from the inside, there might be a second access point. An exterior hatch, a crawlspace connection, a covered stair. Forcing it blindly on a Friday evening while the county drifted toward emergency status seemed, if nothing else, inefficient. I took measurements instead. 23 inches wide, old pine or fir, heavy for its size, hinged on the left, threshold slightly raised, cool air at lower right corner. No signs of recent repainting beyond whatever had been done years ago. No visible electric conduit. No odor suggesting fuel storage. No moisture bloom on surrounding concrete. Hollow depth uncertain. I drew a quick sketch in my notebook. Then the power flickered once, long enough for the basement light to dim to amber before recovering. And somewhere 3 houses over, a dog began barking in a way that made the street sound suddenly less inhabited than it had that morning. That night I slept lightly. Not badly. Not yet. Just lightly enough that I woke to small sounds and arranged them automatically into categories. Refrigerator, furnace, branches on the siding, truck on the avenue, cat on the bed. Nothing important. At 4:12 a.m., I woke to a long, irregular noise from outside that I first took for someone dragging a plastic bin down the sidewalk. When it stopped, I lay still and listened. Nothing followed. At 5:30 I got up, made coffee by habit, and stood at the kitchen sink watching the street come into focus under a low gray sky. Mrs. Alvarez next door was already on her porch in a cardigan and fleece-lined slippers, bringing in the local paper as if nothing in the county had changed. Across the street, the Daltons' teenage son was loading suitcases into the back of an SUV, while his father argued quietly on the phone. No school buses ran. No city bus came down the avenue at 6:10. That absence, more than any siren, landed in the body. I turned on the radio. The station carried weather, then traffic, then a county update delivered by a public information officer whose voice had the careful, over-enunciated steadiness of someone reading language approved by 3 frightened administrators. Residents were advised to remain home when possible. Emergency services were operating at reduced capacity. Non-essential travel was discouraged. A curfew would begin at 8 p.m. Temporary disruptions to water, waste collection, and transit were possible. Possible. That word did too much work. By 9, I had committed fully to staying. There are moments in life when choosing not to move is the more active choice. Roads would clog, gas would become a gamble, and large movement during uncertain public health events usually amplifies exposure rather than reducing it. My house had municipal water while pressure remained, a gas water heater, a wood stove in the living room left by the previous owners, a fenced yard, mature maples for shade in summer, a decent roof, and an unfinished basement that stayed cool year-round. I knew every valve, every outlet, every window latch, every point where the house joined the ground. I had food for a few weeks if I was careful, more if I shifted habits. Better to improve the system I already had than become a variable inside somebody else's. So I went to work, in the old-fashioned sense of the phrase. I labeled shelves. I moved the freezer away from the wall to allow better airflow. I tested flashlights and wrote dates on batteries with a black marker. I set 2 large stock pots under the downspout elbows, in case rain came, before I rigged a better collection line. I cleaned the ash from the wood stove and brought in a first armload of split maple from the garage. I laid tools on the workbench in categories: cutting, fastening, plumbing, electrical, measuring. The house became legible to me in a new way. People like to imagine survival as a matter of bold decisions, but the larger portion of it is usually inventory. What do you have? What can you repair? What can you do without? What is decorative and what is structural? I walked room to room with a pad of paper and answered those questions in order. Kitchen, strong. Gas range, manual ignition possible with matches. Dry goods adequate. Need more salt. Need to shift potatoes from pantry to basement cooler zone. Bathroom, water dependent. Fill extra containers. Use bathtub reserve before pressure loss. Bedrooms, west room best insulated. Could consolidate living there in deep winter if needed. Basement, most valuable volume in house. Stable temperature. Tool access. Potential for long-term storage if kept dry. Garage, moderate fuel reserves. Hardware, extension cords. Spare buckets. Bicycle repair kit. Seed trays. Yard, poor winter food value. Moderate spring potential. 1 raised bed. Compost bin. Rain exposure good. Then, late in the afternoon, I returned to the hidden door. I was not prepared to open it yet, but I wanted to understand its geometry. Using a tape measure and the basement footprint, I compared interior dimensions to the house exterior. There was a discrepancy beneath the front half of the stairs and slightly beyond the north foundation line. Too much to be measurement error, too little to be a full room. Maybe a cold storage nook, maybe an old coal bin modified over time. Houses of that era occasionally kept secrets for boring reasons. I rapped lightly on the door. The sound came back flatter than I expected, as if the cavity beyond was lined or tight. I crouched and put my ear near the seam. For several seconds, there was nothing at all. Then, so faintly I might have invented it, I thought I heard a small sound from the other side. Not movement exactly, more like the settling click of cooling metal or a cup set carefully on a hard surface. I stayed still. The sound did not repeat. That was the first moment the door stopped feeling like carpentry and started feeling like company. Outside, the county grew quieter in strange directions. Sirens were more common after dark, but daytime traffic thinned. People who ordinarily blew leaves or washed cars or let dogs bark unattended stopped doing those things. The neighborhood entered a phase I came to think of as narrowed life. Everyone was still there, but each house had begun to fold inward around its own necessities. By Sunday, the first videos were circulating online from other counties and farther states. Unclear footage, secondhand descriptions, shaky porch recordings of people moving with an odd single-mindedness, not quickly but persistently, as if some internal braking system had failed. The comment sections were unusable within minutes. Official language lagged far behind the evidence. Severe neurological compromise, post-mortem autonomic activity, public misinterpretation of trauma events. Around noon, I stopped trying to make the emerging reality fit old categories. The dead were not staying dead in the usual sense. The sick who passed sometimes rose again, not as themselves, and the bitten who survived long enough often followed. That is not the kind of sentence anyone expects to write soberly at a kitchen table with a sandwich half-eaten nearby. But there it was. Once the fact existed, practical questions followed it with terrible politeness. How sound-sensitive were they? How much body heat did they register? Would they linger at familiar houses? How long before water service failed if staffing collapsed? Would winter help, or only slow things enough to create false confidence? I began a household schedule. Morning. Boil water while gas remained reliable. Check radio. Observe street for 5 minutes without moving visibly near windows. Feed Ruth. Inventory, 1 shelf or 1 system. Afternoon. Work on improvements while daylight held. Eat steadily, not emotionally. Speak to neighbors only at distance unless necessary. Avoid unnecessary noise outdoors. Evening. Secure doors. Cover lower windows with blankets where light spill mattered. Record water use. Check basement door. Sleep in intervals if sleep would not stay whole. That routine, more than any single preparation, steadied me. On Monday, I spoke with Mrs. Alvarez for the first time since the advisories began. We talked through the chain-link fence between our driveways. She was 68, a retired school librarian, and had the useful trait of never wasting words when facts would do. "You staying?" she asked. "Yes." "Good. You?" She gave me a look that suggested the question lacked imagination. I have canned peaches from last summer, and a son in Arizona who is suddenly calling too often. I'm not driving anywhere. I nodded toward her porch. "You have enough medication?" 3 weeks, maybe 4, if I stop pretending my knees deserve luxury. I offered to trade batteries later for ibuprofen if she had any extra. She said she did. Then, after a pause, she asked, "Do you hear anything under your house at night?" I looked at her. She lifted one shoulder. "Just asking. These old places settle." That evening, I checked the hidden door again with a flashlight and found, along the threshold, a thin line of dust disturbed from the inside. Not much. Enough. "Whoever you are," I said quietly, "I'm not trying to force this open tonight." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, so softly I almost laughed at how formal it sounded, there came one knock from the other side. Not random, not settling, not pipes. One measured human knock. I sat down on the bottom basement step and considered the situation. There is a particular kind of calm that comes not from safety, but from the sudden elimination of uncertainty. The hidden space under my house was occupied by someone alive, rational enough to respond to language, and unwilling to open the door. The lock being on the inside now had context. It was not old history. It was current preference. "All right," I said. I did not ask questions immediately. Questions imply a right to answers. Instead, I went upstairs, made another pot of coffee, filled a thermos, found a clean mason jar, and brought both downstairs. "I'm setting coffee by the door," I said. "There's also clean water." I waited, then set the jar and thermos near the threshold and moved back to the stairs. After maybe a minute, I heard the faint scrape of metal on wood, then a narrow shift in the door, less than before, only enough for the jar to disappear. The thermos went next. The door closed again. A second later came 2 light knocks. "Thank you," in whatever code the moment required. That began our arrangement. For 3 days we communicated almost entirely through objects and small sounds. I left water, canned soup, bread, batteries, once a paperback mystery novel I had already read. In return, things occasionally appeared outside the door. An old but working hand-crank radio, 4 jars of preserved green beans dated 2 summers ago, a coil of copper wire, a folded note written in small block letters on the back of a tax envelope. "Do not force upper hatch. Not safe outside fence after dark. Well line still connected to pump house if primed. EK. EK." I stood in the basement reading the note twice, then a third time. There had once been a pump house at the back corner of the lot, before the detached garage was added in the early 60s. I knew that from an appraisal sketch in my closing paperwork. By the time I bought the house, nothing remained but a rectangle of slightly uneven concrete near the fence line and an elderberry bush that leaned over it in summer. I spent the next morning in the yard with a shovel and found, beneath leaves and packed soil, a rusted metal cover the size of a utility box lid. Beneath that, a shallow service pit and the top assembly of an old hand pump, disconnected but intact. The line beneath it, to my mild amazement, still held shape. When I poured primer water and worked the handle slowly, brown water coughed up first, then clearer flow. Mineral heavy, cold, but usable if filtered and boiled. Not much volume. Enough to matter. I looked back at the house then, at the modest brick rectangle I had thought I understood fully, and felt a kind of respectful embarrassment. The people who had lived ordinary lives here before me had left behind more practical intelligence than I had ever bothered to ask about. That afternoon, I wrote my own note. "Thank you. I live here now. Name is Adrian. If you need medical help, knock 3 times. If you want to talk, I'll sit on the stairs at 7 p.m. No pressure." At 7, I went down with a blanket and a mug and sat halfway up the basement stairs, not looking directly at the door, because I thought that might make a stranger less likely to open it. At 7:11, the lock clicked. The door opened inward only a few inches, then more. A narrow wedge of stale, cool air came out first, carrying earth, old wood, coffee, and something like machine oil. Behind it stood a man holding my thermos. He was older than I had expected, perhaps 70, thin in the compact, durable way some men become when age reduces them without making them fragile. He wore a navy cardigan over a thermal shirt and carried himself with an economy that suggested long practice in small spaces. His hair was white and clipped short. He had a trimmed beard and the pale, steady eyes of someone who had spent many hours alone without losing the habit of measuring other people accurately. "You primed the pump, right?" he asked. "Yes." "Good." His voice had a dry radio quality to it, as if each sentence had already been edited once before leaving him. "Your EK?" I asked. "Elias Kessler." "Adrian Holt." "I know. You get mail." That was fair. He opened the door wider. Behind him was not the concrete bunker of imagination, but a carefully built cold room, or root cellar, longer than I expected, and extending partly under the front porch. Shelving lined one wall. An old cot stood at the far end under wool blankets. There was a narrow table with a battery lantern, 2 enamel mugs, and a field radio set neatly beside a toolbox. The walls were rough block and old timber bracing, painted once in whitewash, now gone soft with age. A small vent pipe disappeared upward through the joists. "This was here when I bought the house," I said. "It was here before you bought the neighborhood." He almost smiled when he said it. Over the next hour, with both of us remaining near the threshold, as if some mutual treaty required it, I learned that Elias had been the younger brother of Eleanor Danner, the woman whose estate had sold me the house. He had never technically lived there in the legal sense, but he had maintained the underhouse room on and off for decades because their father had built it in 1962 after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Half storm shelter, half cold storage, half private obsession. People who build such rooms are rarely content with one purpose. There had once been a hidden exterior hatch from the side yard beneath a removable slab near the old pump house. After Eleanor's husband died, her mobility worsened. Elias kept preserves there, repaired radios, and occasionally retreated underground when the rest of life felt too loud. "And you were down there when all this started?" I asked. "I was down here before it started. Easier to remain than to explain." He said that without self-pity. Just fact. He had heard the first county advisories on radio before most people did. He had food, batteries, a camp burner, and the old well line. When movement in the neighborhood turned unpredictable, he locked the door from inside and kept to his room. He had heard me in the house for years, apparently, recognized my routines, and judged me not theatrical, which was the nearest thing to a compliment I think I ever got from him. "You could have told me you were here months ago," I said. "And had what conversation?" he asked. "Hello, I'm the unauthorized appendix under your ranch house?" That was also fair. The arrangement that followed did not happen all at once. It settled into place the way some weather systems do, by degrees too small to dramatize. I continued to live upstairs. Elias remained primarily below, though now with the door unlocked between us. We did not crowd each other. At first we shared information more than companionship. He had a shortwave setup and could pull in regional transmissions after dark when atmospheric conditions favored it. I had maps, tools, and a working understanding of what municipal utilities might do as staffing failed. Together we compared what could still be relied upon. Water. City pressure intermittent after the second week. Old well sufficient for cooking, washing, and supplemental storage if carefully managed. Power. Unstable, but present in short windows. Battery conservation essential. Heat. House livable with wood stove if the west rooms were closed off and blankets layered over hallway openings. Food. Enough for both of us if rationed rationally and extended through pantry rotation, Mrs. Alvarez's preserves, and a later shared arrangement with the Daltons across the street. Noise risk. Manageable if routines remained boring. Boring became, in those weeks, one of the higher virtues. The sick, or the dead, depending on where in the sequence you met them, did not move like movie monsters. They moved like persistence itself, drawn by sound, by repeated activity, by the rough gravitational pull of human presence. A loud house attracted notice. A predictable house sometimes attracted less. I am not claiming that quiet guaranteed safety. Only that noise spent a kind of currency we could no longer replace. So we organized life accordingly. I cooked in batches during daylight. We avoided dropping metal into sinks. I hung quilts over the most resonant basement windows. Elias adjusted the old radio volumes to just above a whisper and taught me to listen through static instead of fighting it. Mrs. Alvarez began leaving small items in a milk crate between our fences at noon each day. Tea, aspirin, once a loaf of anise bread that made the kitchen smell briefly like a world with normal holidays still in it. In exchange, I passed her filtered water, lamp oil, and later, when her knee flared, a folding cane I found in the Danner's attic. By the third week, our block had become, not a community exactly, but a set of adjacent systems learning one another's edges. The Daltons had left on the second day, and, as far as we could tell, never returned. Their house sat quiet, blinds half drawn, 2 bicycles still on the side path. A widower named Preston, who lived near the corner, began using a red bandana on his mailbox as a daily signal that he was stable. Mrs. Alvarez adopted the practice with a blue dish towel tied to her porch rail. I hung a white shop rag from the garage latch each morning after observation and took it down at dusk. No one suggested the code. It emerged the way useful things do when enough people are paying attention. Meanwhile, the hidden room under my house changed in meaning. At first, it had been a curiosity, then a concern, then an occupied secret. After that, it became what many old spaces become once people tell the truth inside them. Part of the emotional structure of the home. Elias showed me the shelves his father had built from salvaged maple. He showed me a crate of county maps from 1978 and a tin of seed packets his sister had forgotten and he had never thrown away. He showed me a hand-painted line on the wall marking the flood height from 1993, though the room had never fully flooded, only taken on seepage near the lower blocks. He showed me a vent shaft hidden in a closet upstairs, behind a panel I had mistaken for pointless carpentry. People used to prepare quietly, he said once, running his hand over the old work table, not because they expected to be heroes, because they didn't assume institutions would get there in time. I knew what he meant. Working in public infrastructure teaches you both to admire systems and to understand their limits. Cities function because thousands of ordinary maintenance acts go right at once. When enough of those acts stop, the city does not explode. It frays. Refuse waits longer at the curb. Water pressure dips at night. Dispatch holds callers on the line. A boarded window remains boarded because no one has time to ask why. By early November, the water mains still carried pressure for part of each day, but not reliably. I stopped trusting the taps except as a bonus. We ran the hand pump in the old pit every morning and transferred water into labeled containers in the basement. I built a sand charcoal pre-filter from 2 stacked food-grade buckets and spare fittings from the garage. Elias improved it by saying almost nothing for 10 minutes, then handing me a better washer arrangement and a length of copper tubing that made the outflow cleaner. We cleaned by schedule, cooked by schedule, listened by schedule, worried, when we had to, by schedule. At night, when the house settled and the wind moved through the maple branches, I sometimes lay awake in the back bedroom and thought about how quickly purpose had narrowed and become, in narrowing, more visible. Before all this, my life had often felt competent, but diffuse. Work, errands, a few old friends, holidays in mild disrepair, quiet weekends. The low-grade ache of a future never damaged enough to become tragic, just altered enough to remain noticeable. Now each day presented itself plainly. Keep water safe, keep heat contained, keep people informed, keep noise low, keep the living from becoming alone if it could be helped. That was not happiness, but it was legible. One evening, near sunset, Mrs. Alvarez asked if she could come inside for 15 minutes to warm her hands by the stove. She had not been in another person's house in nearly a month. I said yes before finishing the question. We set ground rules the way shy people do when pretending not to be relieved. Boots by the mat, voices low, no touching surfaces unnecessarily, leave before dark. She sat in the living room with Ruth in her lap and looked around at my house as if it were both familiar and newly translated. I used to think quiet meant something was missing, she said. Now I think it means something is still working. That stayed with me. A few days later, Elias opened the upper hatch. I should explain that the upper hatch was the one he had warned me not to force. It was hidden behind the removable wall panel in the downstairs coat closet and led, by a steep boxed stair, into the underhouse room. The panel had swollen over time and jammed slightly in its frame. From the closet side it looked decorative or pointless. From below, Elias had kept it bolted. One afternoon, after listening for nearly an hour to intermittent movement on the far side of the alley, and deciding the street was clear enough, he unfastened it and let me see the shelter as his family had once used it. The upper hatch changed everything. Not because it revealed some larger network or buried installation. It didn't. That, I think now, was part of its quiet grace. There was no secret government corridor, no tunnel system, no active machine that had been humming beneath my life. There was only a small, hand-built room made by ordinary people who had worried in their own decade and answered worry with lumber, jars, venting, and stored water. That was enough. The boxed stair allowed us to move supplies discreetly without dragging everything through the basement in view of the small alley-facing window. It meant Elias could come upstairs without crossing the yard. It meant the room beneath the house could serve as cool storage by day and radio room by night. It meant, when Preston from the corner twisted his ankle badly carrying firewood, that we had a clean, quiet place to let him rest for 2 afternoons while swelling came down and movement outside the street ebbed. The house began to function not as a fortress, but as a layered place. That difference mattered to me. I had no desire to command anyone. I did not want a stronghold or a code of entry or the small corrosions of power that arise whenever resources tighten and people start speaking about necessity as if it excuses every tone. What I wanted, and what seemed just barely possible, was a habitable pattern, a domestic rhythm that could include others without dissolving. Tea warming on the stove, boots drying by the back door, a notebook on the kitchen table recording pump output and oat inventory, beside, incongruously, a ceramic bowl of clementines from the last grocery run before distribution failed. By Thanksgiving, if it was Thanksgiving, dates had become loose enough that I checked a paper calendar to confirm. We shared a meal in the living room with the curtains pinned tight and the lamps turned low. Mrs. Alvarez brought peaches. Elias contributed green beans from his shelves. I made rice with canned mushrooms and the last of the butter. Preston hobbled over with a jar of pickled eggs no one would have chosen in easier times, and which disappeared completely anyway. We did not talk about the dead much that evening. They were outside. Everyone knew the terms. Instead, we talked about jobs we used to complain about with insufficient gratitude. Mrs. Alvarez described the smell of old library bindings in August. Preston, who had repaired municipal buses for 30 years, explained with surprising tenderness why older diesel engines were easier to trust than new computerized fleets. Elias told us how his father had installed the shelter vent using scavenged machine shop piping and refused to follow the brochure because a brochure is for people who don't know their own soil. When they had gone and the dishes were done in a basin to save water, I went downstairs and stood for a moment with my hand on the hidden door, though it was hidden no longer, at least not to me. If the world before had taught me anything false, it was the idea that safety is an abstract condition. In practice, safety is nearly always specific. A bucket where you need it, a known voice at the fence, a valve that turns, a lock that works, a room beneath a house built by someone anxious and practical 60 years ago, then kept clean by an old man too private to introduce himself properly. Winter came in earnest a week later. The first hard freeze silvered the yard and made the pump handle burn the skin if touched barehanded at dawn. The city power grid failed for 30 hours, returned for 9, and then failed again in segments. We moved almost entirely into the west side of the house, where the stove heat held best. I tacked wool blankets across the hallway arch and insulated the basement windows with foam board cut from spare packaging. We learned exactly how much wood a day required when temperature stayed below freezing. We learned that Ruth preferred sleeping in Elias's old chair in the radio room because the vent pipe gave off a thread of warmth after cooking below. On especially cold nights, sounds outside traveled farther. Not louder, just farther. A dropped object 3 blocks away. A door not shut gently. Once, an engine turning over and dying. Once, near midnight, a thin, wavering call that might have been a person looking for someone by name, or might have been something else entirely. We stayed still for those sounds. Stillness, too, became a skill one could improve with practice. I do not want to give the impression that fear disappeared simply because routine improved. It didn't. Fear changed texture. Early fear is speculative and wide. Later, fear is narrower and more domestic. You fear the wrong noise, the slipped step, the infected cut, the lost jar, the moment patience fails between people who have become each other's nearest weather. But fear embedded in routine becomes easier to carry because it can be carried alongside useful tasks. In late December, after a week of sleet and low clouds, we picked up a transmission on Elias's radio from a church gymnasium south of the river, where volunteers were coordinating medicine swaps and warming hours in daylight. The signal was weak and intermittent, but it was enough to reintroduce a concept larger than endurance. There were still pockets of intention, still people doing scheduled, boring, necessary things in public for others. Elias listened with his head slightly tilted, adjusting the dial by fractions. "Useful," he said. "Dangerous," I said. "Those often travel together." We did not go immediately. We listened for 4 more days, wrote down names, schedules, phrases repeated across calls. Reliability first. Then, when weather cleared and street movement remained low for 2 consecutive mornings, I rode my bicycle there with a backpack of spare batteries, water treatment tablets, and Preston's request for insulin leads written on an index card inside my coat. The ride through Marlow was the first time I had seen the city beyond my block since the advisories hardened into collapse. Cities do not become ruins all at once. They become selective. Some intersections remain ordinary longer than seems reasonable. A laundromat window still bright on generator power. A diner sign dark but intact. Then, half a mile later, a bus angled into a median. Doors open. No driver. An apartment facade with blankets over every 3rd window. Shopping carts in a side street where no store remained open to receive them. What struck me most was not destruction, but incompletion. Tasks interrupted halfway through. Errands abandoned mid-thought. At the church gymnasium, people moved in the restrained, organized way I had begun to trust more than optimism. Tables by category, water by the side exit, medical requests on clipboards, a retired nurse directing traffic with the same voice she might once have used to manage flu shots at a school clinic. No speeches, no flags. No one pretending the arrangement was larger than it was. I traded what I had brought and returned at dusk with insulin leads, dried beans, and 3 packets of tomato seeds someone insisted I take for spring, if spring still feels like a thing. That night, sitting at the kitchen table while Elias examined the insulin note under a lamp, I realized the hidden door had altered more than my house. It had altered my scale. Before, I thought in service areas, pump curves, household plans. After finding the room and the man inside it, I began thinking more in layers: house, block, route, exchange, season. Not grand strategy, just nested habits of care. By January, the door beneath the stairs was rarely shut. That, in some ways, is the truest ending I can offer for the first part of this story. It remained a real door. It did not lose its weight or its hinges, or the peculiar fact of having once been locked from the inside. But it stopped being an object of suspense and became part of the house's grammar. I passed it carrying kindling. Elias came through it with weather notes and radio updates. Mrs. Alvarez once stood in its threshold holding a plate of cornbread and said in a tone of mild approval, "Well, that explains the missing square footage." There were still hard days ahead of us. Winter was not finished. The city was not healing yet. The dead did not politely withdraw because a few households learned to cooperate. But something had changed for me permanently, and in a way I found unexpectedly gentle. I had spent years living in a house I thought I owned because my name was on paper and my mortgage auto-drafted every month. Then one cold season taught me something quieter and truer. A house is not only the space you can point to on a listing, it is the hidden work inside it, the people it can still hold, the older intelligence stored in its walls, and the small agreements that keep ordinary life from vanishing all at once. For a long time, when I went downstairs at night to check the pump logs or bank the basement stove, I would pause by that once hidden door and feel the faint shift of warmer air moving between levels. At first, I had thought the strange thing was that I found a door beneath my house. Later, I understood the stranger thing was that someone had been patiently keeping it useful all along.